Welcome into another session with International Wine and Food Society, Birmingham, Alabama chapter. We are your hosts, Drew, and today, an awesome topic. We're coming into warmer weather. I'm not sure where, if you guys have noticed, but we are definitely getting into summer now. It's hot, it's humid, so some good, crisp, fruity whites seem appropriate. So with that, we are going to talk about Chenin Blanc today. Oftentimes, I would say, not the first thing that comes to people's mind when they are probably browsing the shelves or trying to pick something for dinner or whatever, but it's a fascinating category because we see like very different styles depending on where it's made and the winemaking techniques applied. So without further ado, let's take some Chenin Blanc.
Yeah, and so we've been kind of focusing lately on these videos on certain regions or styles of wine. So we wanted to kind of go back and kind of focus on a varietal. And while we'll be talking about some specific regions in relationship to Chenin Blanc, we really want to kind of talk about the grape itself and kind of why you should seek these out. Now, he's right. These are not going to be in a section, so in a retail store like, well, not necessarily, like a Sauvignon Blanc would be or a Chardonnay would be.
Right.
You're probably going to be having to look for these within relative country sets, right? Some retail shops might have it laid out as a crisp, refreshing section and a more oaky, buttery section. Okay, well then we're going to look at it in the crisp and light section. Most of the ones that we see, though, have a France section, California, South Africa. And so you're going to have to kind of know what you're looking for this specific varietal in each area of those countries. So we're going to kind of taste and talk at the same time because that's more fun. We're going to start with a selection of wines here. We're going to taste Chenin Blanc from 3 different countries. There are many different countries that grow Chenin Blanc, but we're going to primarily focus on the most popular ones being France, South Africa, and California.
And I would say those are probably our best examples for the archetypes of style as well.
Yeah,
in a sense.
I'm sure some Australians and New Zealanders would disagree, but I think in essence, the style that you're going to get from California and especially South Africa is going to be more similar to those Australian variations, right? The only exception would be in Australia. Sometimes they make a dessert wine out of Chenin Blanc, which will be more reminiscent of some dessert wines that we would see of Chenin Blanc from France, right?
Got it.
So first one we're trying is Loire Valley, and we're going to go into the Loire Valley very, very hard on talking about Chenin Blanc. But this is from an area called Saumur. They call this a Saumur Blanc, which means it's 100% Chenin Blanc from this little appellation in the Loire Valley. So kind of the history of Chenin Blanc, the great thing about science and the great thing about technology is we've gotten a lot better about analyzing DNA and seeing where grapes come from. And while there's a historical kind of we have this written down from here, it doesn't really match up with what the genetics is telling us. So the most recent and up-to-date theory behind this is that Chenin Blanc was actually a grape called Pinot d'Anjou, which came from a grape called Sauvignon, which comes from the Alps, so in that more Savoie appellation. It came over 12th, 13th century, was planted predominantly around a mountain called Mount Chenin, hence Chenin Blanc. So it's a crossing and a kind of an offspring between that grape from Savoie as well as a little bit of Trousseau and Sauvignon Blanc. So, eventually it just kind of became known as Chenin Blanc because it was grown around this. That varietal became more, propagated and kind of unique, and so then they were able to translate that and plant it in other areas of the Loire Valley. We'll get to how it got out of France in a minute, but what we're talking about here is a very high acid white. So the good news with Chenin Blanc is there's many different ways that you can have Chenin Blanc made, right? From this very highly acidic style to a creamier kind of richer style to a dessert style. So this one right here is a definition of a still wine that is nice, light, acidic driven, really pretty.
You mentioned that it's high, the Chenin Blanc just kind of naturally a little bit higher acid. What else do we kind of see? Is it more thicker skin, thin skin? Is it typically, because when I think of Chenin Blanc, I think of it as a slightly cooler climate grape perhaps. And I know that obviously that's going to impact the expressions of the grape and the aromas and everything that we get.
Right.
But if you were kind of to give a rule for France in particular, with Loire Valley, would we consider that a cooler or a warmer type environment for Chenin?
It's cooler climate, but here's where the differences are, and we'll definitely see that in tasting, and you should too. So in the Loire Valley, specifically, but in France in general, when they're growing Chenin Blanc, they are picking at different ripeness levels. So they actually go through the vineyard a couple times, because you can pick Chenin Blanc at a very early stage when it's very acidic, very green, and very kind of ripe fruit, or sorry, unripened fruit. Then they'll come back around and get some slightly more ripe fruit to get some of that fleshier, fruitier aspect to it. And then, of course, if you're making dessert wines, you would wait till the end to get some more of that botrytis style of wine.
Makes sense.
But there's also a bigger difference with how they ferment in France. So typically in the Loire Valley, they are fermenting at higher temperatures, which avoids some of the tropical note fruit flavors that you would get, say, from South Africa or from Australia. Okay. So they're gonna in those Southern Hemisphere New World wines, they're going to ferment at cooler temperatures because they are really wanting to get the citrus flavors. Sorry, we have a Mike Pence fly over here. Hold on. Got it? Yeah. So that lands on my head. So when you try Chenin Blanc from the Loire Valley, you sometimes get a richer style. Not like Viognier or Chardonnay, but a common descriptor that's used with, say, Vouvray, and we'll try one in here in a minute if you want to go ahead and open that one up, is clotted cream, right? So there's that almost cottage cheese thing going on where it's still acidic, it's still kind of got all that fruit, but there's a little bit of a lactic nature from it. Some of that is due to the grapes being picked a little bit later to get a little bit more fruit, a little bit more roundness. Sure. Some of it has to do with malolactic fermentation, which Chenin Blanc's undergoing sometimes in the Loire Valley compared to like a Sauvignon Blanc, which you typically won't. And then there's also with Chenin Blanc, depending on where it comes from, like Savinier or even Vouvray, a little bit of oak aging. They don't want new wood because they don't want to get that vanilla clove thing going on in the wine, but they will use some wood to kind of round off the edges of this highly acidic grape. In fact, in Savinier, which is a fantastic area from really age-worthy Chenin Blanc wines, they'll sometimes use chestnut or acacia wood. Instead of the traditional French oak, because of this unique nature of Chenin Blanc and how it reacts with wood.
So let's talk about this one, the Saumur. Mm-hmm. So when we think about wines from this region, I would say that this is, to me, seems like a very typical wine from Saumur. And when I look at this, the color reminds me of, because we've seen a little bit perhaps of that kind of neutral oak, like you get a little bit almost of that, kind of straw, that kind of pale yellow thing going on.
It's not purely white, greenish kind of Sauvignon Blanc, right? There is a little bit more richness, a little bit more color. This is definitely citrusy. It's definitely light and crisp. It's not going to have that, it doesn't have that clotted cream thing that I was just talking about, for instance. But the price point also would kind of dictate that as well. This is from a producer called Domaine de la Guitterie, and really, 13% alcohol, good alternative to the Loire Valley Sauvignon Blanc. Kind of in that same vein. Slightly less acidic, so again, that a little bit rounded edges, but nice white flowers on the nose, really good.
I'm getting like kaffir lime leaf comes to mind.
Good.
Like just these beautiful citrus notes, like almost like citrus zest.
Yeah.
And I mean, to me, like what I'm thinking.
But the acidity's under control too.
Yeah, it is, and that's what's nice about it is that it doesn't like hit me in the back of the jaw like some of those New Zealand Sauv Blancs will.
Probably not. No.
But in particular, right now, the only thing going through my head is like Thai food. Like I want some like spicy Thai food, spicy beef salad.
Well, and
pad Thai.
I think that lends because of the also not because of any kind of residual sugar aspect, which I usually associate with wines that I want to have with Thai food. But there's really good minerality here, and it grows in limestone and clay, and it really just kind of takes up some of that rocky soil. So.
Yeah, and it almost has this like juiciness kind of factor to it that really makes you want to go back for more. I mean, this is a great way to start this tasting, and this is like I am. All I want to do is sit on the back deck,
crush it,
and just mow through this.
Totally. So transition to the most popular or well-known area for Chenin Blanc would be Vouvray. So Vouvray is a specific area. It's pretty famous, obviously not just for Chenin Blanc. There's a castle in Vouvray. Leonardo da Vinci is buried there. What is unique about Vouvray, or what stands out in my mind too, is it grows, or the whole appellation is a long kind of appellation that goes along the Cher River, the Sonny and Cher, it's spelled Cher, and along the banks is this stretch of what are now caves, but basically it was a hillside that they would dig out all of this very white rock called tuffeau. It's the same kind of fossilized limestone that you would see in Kimmeridgian and Chablis and in Champagne. The reason why they pulled these out, though, was the Loire Valley is, if known for nothing else, castles. It's where all the castles of France are. And all these beautiful castles are of this white stone called tuffeau. Well, after they had dug out these huge caves in the hillside, they're like, well, what can we use these for? Well, they use them for two things. Mushroom farms, growing mushrooms inside of them, and then also it is a constant cool temperature, so it's perfect for aging wines. So they use this natural kind of cave system that they have kind of dug in, and a lot of the old estates are like a small little, don't think like a winery with vines around it, because the vineyards are elsewhere in Vouvray, but where you would see is their tasting room or their winery production, and then right next to it is a cave entrance where they actually take the barrels to go age.
And they still use them today.
Completely. Yeah, some of the older estates. Some of the newer estates don't have those because they don't have the land, but a lot of those are still used for that. It's really cool. And those are the fun winery businesses to go on because you really are going subterranean in a sense because that's where it is. So
now I will say right off the bat with this one, if we're going to get into the aromas and the flavors and all that, it smells a little riper. It smells a little more like, I feel like we went from that like super citrus side of the fruit spectrum to now we're moving towards a little more of that kind of ripe, like stone fruit, like almost like mango type things, passion fruit.
Mango for sure. And with that, there's a little bit of that residual sugar, right? There's a little bit of a cloying, it's more viscous, right?
And I believe I would have to guess that our alcohol content would indicate a little residual as well. Yeah, 12.5.
Yeah, exactly. So we went from a 13 to a 12.5, and part of that is just going to be that residual, but it's also, it's not syrupy at all, but in comparison, it coats the tongue a lot more, right? So this is one where, you have a lot more, I would say even more so now with the spicy food applications here. So this is going to, whereas this would be fine with spicy food and also with like a lot of seafood dishes, this is going to be like, I want some heat.
When I think classic Chenin Blanc, this is what kind of comes to mind.
Well, and that's what everybody thinks of, right? So, if a lot of people order, and especially in France, obviously, but even in the U.S., they'll order Vouvray because they know Vouvray. They don't even know it's Chenin Blanc, right? It is kind of comes synonymous with the grape, just like Sancerre has with Sauvignon Blanc, and Chablis or Meursault or something like that with Chardonnay. It is that kind of defined region. So,
just make sure that wandering fly doesn't get a smart idea and take a nosedive for a bath or anything.
Be one way to die. So the one thing we wanted to open up and show as another possibility is these are a little bit more far and few between. You don't see these as much as say Cremant de Bourgogne or obviously Champagne, but because of the highly acidic nature of Chenin Blanc, it is a prime candidate to be made into sparkling wine. So this is a Cremant de Vouvray basically, and this is from a wonderful producer called Huet, which is Huet. We'll put that up on the thing. But fantastic dry style. They make all kinds of styles, honestly. There's demi-sec and dry. You don't get a whole lot of brut, nature, or zero dosage wines from here because they will have a little bit of RS that they added in the dosage. But because of the high acid component as well as the ripe fruit, these as well as other Chenin Blancs, very much an ageable grape. I mean, some of them I've had that were aged as long as some of the best Rieslings from Germany. You can tell this one's got, look at that color.
Yeah, you can tell that spent some time in some wood there.
It's golden, it's gorgeous, and it's also lees aging because of because all the lees that got dispersed.
Yeah, right. So, Domaine Huet, this is the same producer that does some of those more higher end. I guess we would call them cuvées or higher end. Like
absolutely.
Yes. So the Merlot and things like that, where you can get again that's Chenin Blanc that has this beautiful color where it's already seen time in wood, and those wines honestly they can lay down 30, 40 years.
Well, and look incredible. And look at this. This is a current vintage, and it's a Brut 2014. So this is already seeing close to 6 years of age on it already, and it's just going to develop even better. It's a pétillant style technically, so it's not going to be as bubbly as a champagne method, but I mean,
that is fantastic.
right. I mean, it's just
I was going to try to come up, you were giving these wonderful descriptors, and I'm sitting there and I'm smelling all of it. But then the only thing that I could think of when I actually tasted it was, I want more of that.
Yeah, it's really good. And lots of applications here.
It's got so many characteristics, too, that are reminiscent of vintage champagne.
Yeah.
I mean, that slightly
But,
nutty.
but half the price, which is great.
This is the first time I've had anything like this.
Right.
This is beyond spectacular. What would you say, like, the average retail, not maybe of this one in particular, but kind of the category, like, where do you see these?
Yeah, there's some
kind
some sparkling Vouvrays that would get into the low 20s. This one is it's kind of a little bit older. It's a vintage. This one's going to be in the low to mid 30s. But you can still find some that are hitting around that $20 retail price point. Again, this one's got a little bit more complexity to it. That one's going to be those are typically a little bit lighter. Kind of think alternative to like Cremant de Bourgogne or Cremant d'Alsace or something like that. But
and I actually like, it's funny because like typically like champagne and oysters, right? But like with this one in particular, like yes, oysters, but I'm thinking more like charbroiled oysters or oysters Rockefeller. Like
That's
it's just got
like
like
that.
a little bit
a little
extra
smokiness.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I've also had it with like a paella before that worked really well, like a seafood paella. So that's kind of French Chenin Blanc. So we wanted to talk about a couple other areas because Chenin Blanc was very successfully because it could grow in a lot of different climates, as well as because of the nature of the grape being highly acidic. You could have it in hotter areas and just let it kind of ripen up a little bit and get more ripe fruit flavors. It worked well as an export grape. Comparatively, it's a lot easier to manage than Pinot Noir. The biggest issue when you get into warmer weather is that you've got to control the vigor or the yield of the grapes. Otherwise,
Vines get real happy in warm weather.
They will grow, and they will go too far, and you get very uninteresting wine. So the next wine we have is actually a Chenin Blanc blend. It's called Tea Leaf. But I wanted to highlight the Chenin Blanc in this from South Africa. So grape comes from France. Total production out of France of just Chenin Blanc is like 1.2%. So it's very little actual output. South Africa, 20% of all South African wines, one in five is Chenin Blanc.
That's incredible.
It's the number one producer of the grape. It is probably the white wine known from South Africa. Over the years, either through apartheid or through government regulation, similarly that happened with the red wines as well, like Pinotage, there was a lot of bad Chenin Blanc coming out of South Africa because they were letting the vines go crazy and just producing as much juice as they could. Fortunately, over the last 25 years, they have curtailed that. They have gotten back to like controlling yields, making quality grapes, and so now the Chenin Blanc and Pinotage that you're seeing, I'm like a plug for Pinotage, that you see coming out of South Africa is a lot better quality and a lot more unique to the terroir that you're getting it from. So this is called Tea Leaf. Like I said, this is predominantly like over 80% Chenin Blanc. There is also some Grenache Blanc and a very interesting Palomino grape, which is what we see from sherry, if you remember our
Yeah, let's get into what we can expect, aroma, flavor, all that from South African Chenin Blanc. So again, a really fun region that I think the real play here is the fact that we've got some very different price points. And the thing that excites me before we even get into any of those things is just the screaming value that this is, where it's a weeknight bottle. If you want to pair it up with dinner one night, pair it with dinner. If you want to have it as an aperitif, do that. If you want to have it sitting on the back porch, on a Friday afternoon,
right,
then this price point makes a lot of sense. And I think that's one of the real fun things about this varietal is that it's not white Burgundy. Okay, this is not going to be. We're not going to have Chenin Blanc that is $150 a bottle, $200 a bottle. I mean, those things exist.
But not from South Africa. And
right.
If they do, they're very unique. And look, South African Chenin Blanc is not going to be, of course there's going to be an exception. There's a South African winemaker out there who's going to disagree with me, but you're typically looking at wines that you want to consume young, you are wanting to kind of have within 1 to 3 years, and they're not going to be more age-worthy. Part of that is just in the style that they're made. They're, again, fermented at lower temperatures, so they're more tropical in nature, but they're also just not as acidic and, it's just not the style that they're going for, right? So, a very good comparison would be like Syrah from Côte Rôtie versus Shiraz from Australia.
Yeah,
There's some very good ageable Shiraz from Australia, but in general, you're looking at a, drink it now kind of wine. South Africa, California to the same degree, and Australia, they kind of be very similar.
So all the New World,
New
World regions are going to be,
again, exceptions there everywhere.
Of course, but that's a great rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Like on the New World side of things, we need to be thinking
drink now,
3 years tops type deal. Whereas some of the classic French ones from Saumur or Vouvray or Sauvignon, those are going to be more of our. You can drink them now, but you could also lay them down and bury them.
But they are going to age. They are more age worthy. So again, with this one, you're getting a lot more peach, a little bit more kind of tropical passion fruit kind of flavors.
For sure.
It's rounder, but still got the acidity, not as much acidity. So this is, again, we say BTG in the trade, but by the glass across a bar is where you're typically going to see this poured. It goes great with salads and seafood. So it goes good with food, but it's also just fine on its own. And I think the way I kind of usually put it is, like, I don't have to think about this wine, right? It's good, right? This one, I kind of want to deconstruct it. I want to kind of think about it a little bit more heavily.
So that's like the intellectual moment versus, hey, I just really want to relax and kind of unwind moment.
Totally, and both, and that's not a judgment of quality. It's just a difference of like how I approach the wine and how I approach the tasting. So.
Now, you had mentioned something the other day when we were talking about even doing Chenin Blanc that I thought was fascinating, and it was when you started to go into a little bit of the information regarding, how in South Africa how they used to have this great hold. They didn't know it was Chenin Blanc.
Yeah. So Chenin Blanc is kind of like a similar story like you see with Carmenere or Merlot grown in other areas. It was commonly thought to have been something else, and then after DNA testing and kind of people doing research, they figured, this is actually Chenin Blanc. So in the case of South Africa and some parts of Australia, they thought it was Verdejo from Spain. Actually, it was Chenin Blanc. But in South Africa especially, this was known as Steen for many, many years, S-T-E-E-N. And it's just, you can sometimes still see that referred to in books. You'll see it in some labels, maybe on some older wines, but that just means Chenin Blanc. So,
and there's a phenomenal resource. If you're a member of IWFS here in Birmingham, you have the opportunity, and many of you did, attend both in person and virtually the tasting that we did with a winery called Lagier Meredith. And that is the Meredith part. That is Dr. Carol Meredith, who has done outstanding research and publications in the field of basically grape genetics and looking
origins,
at and figuring out what the parent grapes were and how we got to where we are now, and examining where these things come from, and then you start to get an understanding of why does this grape have thin skin versus thick skin? Why does it behave this way in this climate versus that way? And just an absolutely fascinating person to check out her research. Again, if you've never done that or never heard of her, I would highly encourage you to do so. She's featured. She's in a couple of things on SOM TV and stuff like that. So she's a phenomenal resource, and it's interesting because we were talking, and it was one of those things where. Mentioning that as the reason that grapes move and go from France to South Africa, as humans move across the globe throughout history, they take grapes with them, they take wheat, they take barley, they're making bread, they're making beer, they're making wine. And that's, again, it's why we go from this nomadic, mammal species to actually like domesticating and settling in villages and then towns and cities.
Because we were drunk and we couldn't move around a whole lot.
Yeah, again, I mean, you got to have a hotel so you can sleep it off for a day, right?
Well, plus it was also safer than water back then. So, in the case of South Africa, Chenin especially, it was the Dutch East India Company that really kind of helped to push that there. So, next, and last but not least, but this is 100% Chenin Blanc from Central Coast in California from a property called Field Recordings. And this is a really good kind of in between the two styles, right? So you've got the kind of richer, kind of more tropical flavor profile that you get from South Africa because of the little bit more heat that you get in the Central Coast compared to other places. But there's really good underlying acidity here.
Yeah, this has got just, you used the word zippy, I think, before, and
That's really good.
This wine is just—it's always a treat because, like, I feel like I just want to like grab people who like only buy like Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Grigio and just like shake them like, drink this. Just try it once, I promise.
It's a great idea too because it's a good in between those two grapes, right? So if you are having, people over or maybe a dinner party or something like that, and you're like, I know these two each drink Sauvignon Blanc typically, or these two drink Chardonnay. Yes, the right answer is to buy a lot of Chardonnay and a lot of Sauvignon Blanc. Don't get me wrong, but also look at these kind of grapes that can kind of bridge the gap in between and kind of be a happy for everybody kind of wine. So this is and in California and in the U.S. in general, Chenin Blanc is grown a lot. A lot of times it's used for a blending grape. One of the most popular in our market is the Pine Ridge Chenin Blanc Viognier blend that they do. They just came out with a sparkling as well, kind of lending to how well that does for sparkling. The biggest areas, though, that you can kind of see quality Chenin Blanc coming out of, though, is Sonoma. There's some in Napa. Chapelet makes a great one in Napa there. Very small production. And then in Washington, in the Columbia Valley and in Yakima Valley, AVAs. And so, Chenin Blanc is, while probably not as well known in the domestic scene, it is grown. And we see it sometimes in blends, we sometimes see it 100% varietal, but it is a up and coming grape for a domestic production kind of grape.
Yeah, and I would say, like, keep your eyes open more and more on restaurant lists and pay attention because these are the type wines that the new world Psalms, the new age Psalms, right? Like all the younger crowd, like these are the things that they kind of geek out on. So you're going to see it more.
Right.
And the reason I say not to pass it up and to pay attention is because there's so much value to be had here, price point wise, compared to maybe other varietals that,
especially Chardonnay.
Yeah, that you can get fantastic, a great glass of wine at a restaurant that's going to pair with several menu items. Or when you go into a retail store and if you can't find, they're going to have Chenin Blanc. If you don't see it, ask. Because again, what you mentioned earlier, maybe it's in the France section, and because of, again, it's not as widely available here yet.
Right.
So you may need some help finding it, but again, don't pass over it. These wines are absolutely incredible, and the thing that's fun is that the wines are world class at each price point. No, from the value play all the way up to some of those Beaumard aged Sauvigners from Clos de Papillon.
Right. Well, I mean, and they really do take on an unsung hero kind of characteristic to them, no matter where they're from. So, yeah.
Well, listen, we hope everybody enjoyed kind of this journey and this dive into the rabbit hole of Chenin Blanc. So we thank you first and foremost for listening, to watching. We will ask that you click the little button down here, subscribe. Get us in your feed. If you got any questions or want to see any topics covered in particular, please let us know. And of course, definitely want to give a big heartfelt thank you and shout out to our host here. We are at Golden Age in Mountain Brook, Alabama, and we are currently in their kind of private room in the back, which is, if you're looking for somewhere to do a company get together, a tea or just anything like that, or you just want to come hang out with some friends, on a Friday afternoon and grab yourself some Chenin Blanc, please do so. Come check it out. The wine selection here is fantastic. They've got a great charcuterie program. It's just a beautiful store, and you're really going to enjoy yourself being here. So with that, cheers.
Cheers.